I want to go back to the point you made earlier about kind of like pundit brain. And everybody's feeling like they got to, weigh in and seem like the smart person in the room and the reasonable person and the pragmatic person. Because I do think that kind of thinking has infected the left in a really interesting and frankly frustrating way, where there is a real allergy to being perceived as having tried something for fear that you might be perceived of having tried and failed something. And I wonder if you can speak to kind of the historical, put that in the context of a historical trajectory of left movements and, whether or not that allergy to failure is something that is new. Because to me, it's one of the most toxic influences that I see around here. If a plan doesn't have 100% certainty of passing, it is perceived as, you're a moron. Basically, you're just the most, immature person. The kinds of things that folks used to say about Bernie and Bernie supporters, you must just be a 19-year-old living in your parents' basement who doesn't know anything about the world, is the kind of messaging that I feel from other parts of the left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that people say to me a lot, you've probably even said it to me at some point. Oh, you're so optimistic, right? and the fact of the matter is that everyone says that to those of us who are optimistic, and I'm a great optimist. There is simply no question of that. Everyone who says that is implicitly saying, yeah, you've got this default optimistic position, right? You believe these things are possible. And so I can't really take that seriously, right? It's fun to hear you speak about it, but really, at the end of the day, I'm going to need to go find a cynic to tell me we can't do this. Because that person I know is smarter, right? That person I know is more experienced. That person I know, just kind of, they've got their finger on the pulse better because cynicism, right? And skepticism and a certainty that things aren't possible. That's realistic. Mm-hmm. We're taught that across, that is hardcore, jammed into us, not just in politics, but throughout life. But here's the interesting thing about it, right? I actually think that by and large, as somebody who's been a pundit and who's been around it a lot, that I think cynicism and skepticism, by and large, are, they're evidence that you're scared, right? That and that maybe you're afraid you really don't know what's possible. Mm. And the easiest thing to say is, could turn out bad. Maybe it's not a good idea to try that. And the people I learned from are the people who never had a chance. It was never going to work. It was always an uphill drive, and it was unlikely to succeed, and yet spent their lifetime doing it. Yeah. When I was a kid, one of my first big projects I ever worked on was oral history of veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that fought in the Spanish Civil War against fascism. They were America's premature anti-fascists. They were people from, not just New York City or San Francisco, but from rural Wisconsin, where I come from, who, when Franco, rose up against the elected government of Spain with the support of Hitler and Mussolini in the 1930s, said, this is it. This is the fight against fascism. And our government won't do what it needs to do. So they literally went illegally into Spain to fight against fascism, to join the people, the farmers, the peasants of Spain to fight against Franco and the fascists. And half of the Americans who went died. And the other half came home, survived, and then they were told they were premature anti-fascists. And because they were on the left, they were chased throughout. Sometimes they weren't even allowed to fight in World War II because they were thought to be too anti-fascist. In the aftermath, no, I'm not kidding. In the aftermath of World War II, they were red baited. They were chased out of jobs. They were even fired by unions, right? And when I encountered these folks, men and women, mostly men, in the 1980s, kind of later 1980s, they were old by then. They had been at it for more than 50 years. The youngest of them was a guy named Abe Smrodin, who had joined up at 14 or 15. And he was like 70. right? So, I mean, they were all old, and yet they were still at it. They would show up at Central America protests. They would show up at labor protests. They would knock doors and picket and campaign and believe. And the interesting thing about it was that you saw at the end of the day that they were right. Not about everything. They got things wrong along the way. But they knew that they wanted economic and social and racial justice. They wanted an international order in which colonialism and imperialism were taken on. Some of them were communists. Some of them were socialists. Some of them were just independent radicals. But they were clearly on the left. They got beat up a lot for it. You could, any one of them, you can look at and say, why wouldn't you just give up? Why wouldn't you not believe? And yet, the weirdest thing was, almost all of them that I interviewed were incredibly optimistic. They believed. They believed. And now we look at, okay, what were they for? Well, a lot of the things they were for are the things that we're still wrestling with. We're still trying to get around to. And so the lesson I take from it is we need to be optimistic. We need to believe in what is possible, because at the end of the day, those moments come, right, where everything's thrown out of whack. You have a pandemic that the government is unprepared to deal with, and mass unemployment that extends from it. Oh my gosh, I know that'll never happen. But let's say that if that happened, right, and then suddenly we find out, the government's got trillions of dollars. They could spend money like crazy, right? And I thought we had deficits and debts and we couldn't do anything. No, it turns out we can get as much money as we want. Oh, well, really? So suddenly everything you told us we couldn't do was a lie, right? All right. So if it's a lie, then maybe it's a lie that we can't have single payer health care. And maybe it's a lie that we can't have a living wage for everybody. And maybe, in these moments, those of us who believe in what is necessary step in with our answers and we succeed. Now, you can tell me that's never going to happen, John, and you're just too naive and you're too optimistic and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I'm going to believe it. I'm going to believe that that's the point, because I think that was the point of the abolitionists in the period from the founding of this country in original sin until the Civil War. They kept pushing. You could be born, live your entire life, and die an old person as an abolitionist and not see the end of slavery. And yet they carried that struggle forward, and the point came where something happened, something real happened. You can be A. Philip Randolph, right? A. Philip Randolph is the most radical guy in New York City in 1917, 1918. They called him the most dangerous man in America. He published The Messenger, a socialist publication. He was a radical. He ran for statewide office in New York on Eugene Victor Debs's ticket. And they, come on, what chance does that guy have, right? And he ended up organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, got on the AFL-CIO board. They still ridiculed him, pushed him aside, said he believed too much. He never joined the Democratic Party. He remained a socialist throughout his life. And yet he got into those rooms with presidents of the United States. He made demands. He called the March on Washington in 1963. And on the morning after the March on Washington was great. The morning after, A. Philip Randolph, they actually had the socialist parties gathering to kind of deconstruct the march. And Randolph was there, right? And if you read the report on it, which, by the way, was covered by the New York Times, because the New York Times used to cover socialists. Oh, it did? Yeah. Oh,
interesting.
Much more thoroughly than they do now. If you read the article, which is, by the way, on the front page of the New York Times, A. Philip Randolph's response after that incredible march, after that incredible moment where they went to the White House and had sandwiches with John Kennedy and got their picture taken at the Lincoln Memorial and everything, A. Philip Randolph said, folks, we're going to have to do some more marching. Right? He was completely unsatisfied. He said, we got to do. And what did he turn around and do? In a matter of about 2 years, they had developed their freedom budget for all Americans. Right? They literally proposed a social democracy. And they got into Lyndon Johnson's office, and they were presenting this and working on it. And I guess what I would say is, I'm with those folks. I'm with the folks who believe that we get ready for our moment. We have our marches, we have our pressure, we push, and sometimes it works, right? It actually happens. You have a march You have other incidents that occur of great consequence. And then you get a constitutional amendment to get rid of the poll tax. You get the Civil Rights Act. You get the Voting Rights Act. You get a war on poverty. You get Medicare and Medicaid, all in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And I am always, of the view that 2 years it's always out there. It's always possible. And I think that the only thing often that stops us from getting that is a Democratic Party that says, oh, this isn't the time. We're just not going to do it now. We'll do it someplace down the line. We'll have to build to it. And so, and the tragedy of it is, I can guarantee you that so many opportunities have been missed because of cynicism. I guarantee you that if Bill Clinton had gone for single-payer Medicare for all healthcare in 1993, he might have lost the initial vote, but they would not have had the setbacks that they did in 1994. Clinton would have been reelected. 98, they would have done better. And at some point along that line, we would have gotten single payer. I know that to be true. And I know that so many other things that we should have now, we could have gotten, except for people at the top level of the Democratic Party who kept saying, it's not the time. It's too far to go. And so if we remember that history, if we understand that history, then this is the point at which we have to say no more.